How's it going, everyone? Thank you so much for taking the time to click on this video. Hope you're all having a pretty good day today. For those of you who don't know, my name is Dylan Abernathy and I'm an environment artist here in the games industry. It's been a couple months since my last upload. There's been a lot going on behind the scenes to keep me busy, but where we left off with our last post, I was actually having quite a bit of fun. For those of you who didn't get a chance to see it, what we ended up doing was recreating a sort of patterned tile floor for a large-scale interior of a video game environment. But what made that so fun on my end was we used a game I was really enjoying at the time. It's kind of like an example that we could reverse engineer and recreate in Unreal Engine 5. We used the game Near Replicant and sort of recreated a patterned tile floor from one of their library environments. This seemed to go over really well. The video is one of the most positively received that I've posted in quite a while, and I had a ton of fun making it on my end as well. So what I kind of wanted to do in this video is continue that trend of taking a game I'm enjoying and maybe reverse engineering it inside of Unreal. And that game at this moment is Guilty Gear Strive by Arc System Works. This is a game that has a beautiful visual style, and as someone who only usually makes photorealistic stuff, it's definitely piqued my interest as to maybe how they could be approaching this sort of stuff. They're doing it in Unreal Engine as well, which is primarily where I work, so it's always really fascinating to see how someone else takes such a different approach. So I thought what we could do in this tutorial is see how they sort of set up their stylized shaders and see if we can recreate it on our end. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and dive in and see what all the hype is about.
These bullshit's blazing, still my heart is blazing. If the word kill me, I don't need a new word under you. Soon you will know, we already know the smell of the game.
Probably the biggest compliment I can give Guilty Gear Strive is that I'm not really someone who's interested in fighting games or heavy metal, yet I absolutely love everything about this game. Everything about this game is polished to such a fine sheen, but more impressively, everything feels so unified. Personally, I find the larger that a game gets, the more opportunities there are for it to lose its identity and direction, and I feel like Guilty Gear Strive is the complete opposite of that modern AAA issue. The visuals and music and gameplay, they all fit together so perfectly, and I just can't help but appreciate how well this game must have been directed. All that said, we're artists and we're here to talk about the game's art, so it should go without saying that the visuals here are just completely breathtaking. Having a locked camera helps a ton with controlling what's shown to the player, and the devs are taking such amazing advantage of that here. The approach to recreate an anime-like art style is done incredibly well by being very precise with their shadows and line work, as well as the characters posing. Characters move with a capped frame rate in this game not only to mimic hand-drawn animation, but also to allow the devs to specifically pose every single frame of animation by hand. On top of that, you often see models being swapped out in real time to emulate the look of smear frames and to exaggerate certain movements. So to summarize, every single aspect of Strive's presentation is intentional. In just a moment, we're going to be going over how we can recreate the style of shader used here in Guilty Gear, as well as get some fun outlines to make our assets pop a little bit more. If this is something you'd like to follow along with, I'll include a download link to the shader and all the setups I'm using in the description of this video below. But before diving into the actual production of all of that, I wanted to take a quick moment to discuss that last point I had there, which was having everything be intentional. It's been pretty interesting peeking over at the stylized art community as someone who's focused mostly on photorealism. Undeniably, most of what we do overlaps, but the areas that differ both seem very exciting and pretty intimidating. I find it strange that there's this pretty big misconception for a lot of beginner artists that stylized art is much easier than photorealistic art. I actually experienced quite a few of these comments when I had the pleasure of mentoring some beginner artists earlier this year. While I can see where they're coming from, I feel like it's a very half-baked way of looking at things. Now, I'd never claim that one artistic medium is more difficult than another, but what I would say is when it comes to stylized versus photorealistic, the skills an artist is required to have are just distributed differently. With photorealism, we're tasked with being able to recreate something we know to be grounded in reality through PBR and sensible asset assembly, as well as sort of build in some clear environmental storytelling. Stylized art factors all of these in as well, but has a larger focus on baking in a mood by exaggerating and simplifying its elements, things such as shape language, color, and lighting. I feel that this can be viewed as easier because on the surface level there are technically less details shown, but what's really going on is a thorough understanding of what the most important elements are and how to best express them. A great real-world example of this would be the Pokemon anime versus the live-action Detective Pikachu film. Sure, the realistic renders on the Pokemon are really impressive, but a character such as Jigglypuff in its simplest form is just going to be more appealing than its real-world counterpart. It's partially why the show is animated to begin with and why it was so successful. It allows for deliberate, intentional designs that convey everything you need to know about the character, and then anything else is just overkill. The simplification and exaggeration also allows the audience to suspend their disbelief, allowing for more wacky, outside-the-box ideas to be explored and still taken seriously. Another great example of this would be the animated versus live-action Disney films. Having an expressive singing lion works really well as a cartoon, but it doesn't tonally match a photorealistic art style, so when it's translated into that medium, things seem a little bit off. So why is any of this stuff important? Well, it just goes to show that stylized art is far from easy, and games that manage to pull it off well have a seriously good understanding of what's important to show the viewer, since additional details have been intentionally stripped away, rather than left out for the artist's convenience. When you factor in that most game engines are also built to primarily aid with a more realistic production, adding things such as mega scans and realistic PBR lighting, anytime a game pulls off a unique look, it's always worth celebrating. So how does stylized art get made then? Well, the process differs from game to game, as you can imagine. Sometimes it's the standard PBR workflow, just with a more strict color palette and exaggerated shapes. Sometimes its style is partially dictated by how many polygons and textures the target hardware can afford, and a lot of the times it's something completely unique to what that game needs. One example of that last point would be Guilty Gear Strive, so let's go ahead and take a look at the shader I made to emulate the look of the game. Alright, so let's finally jump into UE5 here and take a look at some examples and how they're set up. Just to start off, what I want to do really quickly is shout out a DeviantArt user who goes by the name of ODV890. This person has essentially ripped and uploaded all of the character models, weapons, pretty much anything you'd want visually from Guilty Gear Strive, as well as a bunch of other games. I think you can see some Dragon Ball Z up here. But I'll leave their page in the description below. All you have to do is hit this download button and you'll get access to all the textures and models or whatever for any character you want. And it's been incredibly useful. If I didn't have these assets to start with, I really wouldn't know how to reverse engineer this stuff. So huge shout out to this person here. And if you get access to the shader of mine through my Gumroad in the description, you can plug in any of these files and the shader will sort of, make those things work the way that they're more likely to be intended to be used. So yeah, really great stuff. One thing as a bit of a heads up though, that person has quite a bit of not safe for work stuff on their page, which is totally fine, but I thought I'd just give you a heads up in case you're opening that in a more public area. But anyways, let's go ahead and take a look at the model that I downloaded from them. And this is just kind of our control group here. This is the bare bones, like no work was really done. This is just grabbing the model, applying the base color, and making sure it's not really too reflective or anything like that. So 0 into specular, 1 into roughness. So with this being the absolute bare bones, we can just see the base color on the model, and it's pretty lackluster. It leaves a lot to be desired. The colors are super muted. There's no emissive glow. There's really no personality to this. And it goes to show that this thing was designed from the start to be intended to be used with a very specific shader in mind. It's fine. I like the design of it a lot, so that's kind of carrying it, but it's very clearly, there's, like I said, much more to be desired with this. So if we move over, this is kind of the shader I recreated for this weapon, and it's going to apply to pretty much any of the Guilty Gear models. To be totally blunt and upfront, I doubt that this is a 100% faithful recreation. Obviously I have done some research, but I'm really shooting in the dark here as far as recreating this stuff because we don't really know how they made their stuff specifically. We can reverse engineer stuff, but it's not going to be 100% accurate. But I'm still pretty happy with the results. So let's go ahead and take a look at what exactly is being done here. We have a nice outline around our model, which is making it pop, which is really, really nice. The shadows have a very harsh cutoff, as you can see here, which is helping a lot, especially on the spherical area here. If we tilt our model, it's going to go into darkness, so it's going to be reacting to lighting in real time. And then if we tilt it up, it gets brighter, and then not only does it get brighter, but once we move it into a more harsh lighting angle, it's going to be getting a reflection on top of it. So there's quite a bit going on. We can also actually grab the sunlight and move that around as well. And that's going to update that stuff in real time. So pretty cool stuff. Like I said, probably not 100% accurate, but I think it's pretty close to what's going on in game, and I'm pretty happy with it. So there are 5 major things we're going to be going over in this tutorial to recreate this style of shader. The first is going to be the outlines on the model, how we can get a nice pop on our models. The second is going to be texture maps and UVs. Guilty Gear Strive uses a very specific to Guilty Gear style texture map and UV layout, so that'll be interesting to go over. Next is going to be the decals on the model. After that, we're going to go over the shader and how everything is sort of plugging into one another. And then finally, we're going to be going over 3 different lighting variants for that shader. One thing I didn't expect was that lighting, when it comes to this kind of shader, is a little bit more complicated than I expected. I guess I didn't really know what I was getting into when I started, but that was definitely the biggest challenge of it all, so that'll be an interesting way to wrap things up. But anyways, with all of that said, let's go ahead and start off with that first point, which is going to be the outlines. Alright, so to make the outlines on these models, it's actually pretty simple. The method that we're going to be using is called creating an inverse hull. So let's actually go ahead and open this guy up and see what we're working with here. The first thing you'll probably notice is that we're actually using a blueprint for this, which normally we would just sort of have our model and apply a material to it or whatever. But instead we're going to be having a blueprint set up, and that's going to make this a little bit unconventional, but you'll see it's actually very, very simple and straightforward. So we have our main sword here with our normal materials applied to it, and then we have a secondary sword. This is the exact same model underneath it, but in this case we have a different material applied to it. And what exactly is going on here, if I go ahead and turn off the visibility of this, is we have a secondary model underneath, and the material is kind of doing all this heavy lifting to create an outline. So what's going on with that material is the normals of the mesh are being inverted. They're then being double-sided, so we can see this sort of black recreation on top of them, and then they're being pushed out slightly in the world position offset. So let's go ahead and look at this model and open up the material. So we're going to have a material instance here, and then let's actually open up the master material. So it really is just like an emissive being plugged into the color. And then, like I said, we're making sure it's double-sided in the details here. And I'll make this bigger in case you want to recreate it. But we're essentially just double-siding everything and pushing out the world position offset. Super simple stuff. And then if we expose some parameters, what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to have mesh-specific controls here. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the things we can adjust. The most basic and obvious one is going to be the outline color. This is actually a lot of fun, so we can sort of, maybe if you have a glowing power-up or something like that you want to emulate, but you can also change the color. You could probably set a node to sort of scale through all of this stuff and make it glowing like this, kind of like a Super Smash Bros. Final Smash effect or something like that. But just for this, just to recreate the look of animation, we're going to keep it black. And then we also have outline. So this is going to be the value of how far this stuff is coming across. As you can see, things can fall apart pretty quickly with this. I like to keep the value pretty small, maybe even something like that, and really hug it to the model. Because, yeah, based on how things are set up and how the normals are applied, things will just break apart. You'll notice with something like the sphere, because it's very round and very continuous, like this works totally fine. So I can probably guarantee if we added some more edges and stuff like that to this model, it might look a little bit better. But for now, I'm just going to sort of hug the hull a little bit closer to the model, and the outline is still going to pop quite a bit. So some very basic controls, but this is really nice because with this method we essentially have full control over every single asset, and we can, you know, change the color, change the thickness and whatnot dependent on whatever asset we're applying to. So that's going to give us a lot of freedom and control. So if anyone has ever done any outlines, one of the questions you might be thinking is like, hey, isn't this quite a bit more expensive? Pretty popular method that you see a lot of the time is people doing this stuff in the post-processing volume, and then everything gets an outline around it. Very simple. Once it's set up, it's pretty much done. And then if you look at this, there's also some downsides because this model is actually 3 times as expensive as it should be. So we essentially have all the geo from the main sword, and then we have a second sword, but that second sword has double-sided faces. So we're getting like a very expensive version of this same sword. So you might be thinking that's kind of pretty dreary, kind of damper. Things aren't really too optimized in that method, but honestly, it's pretty fine. Polygons really aren't the most expensive thing in the world, and the models and the textures in this game are super bare bones and simple, so it's not like things are very expensive. On top of that, there really isn't a lot being rendered because it's literally just 2 characters and a simple backdrop. But I really think the main reason that this method is so good is because there really isn't a lot actually using this. I'm going to go ahead and pull up a clip here. But if we go ahead and take a look at this scene, like the entire background doesn't have any of this stuff. The only thing that's getting this kind of triple cost treatment are the characters and then the characters' weapons. And this is doing a lot of kind of cool, important things at the same time. So the main thing is it's really making the things that we want to look at pop, right? Like the background is still stylized, but it's more of like a maybe almost League of Legends style where there's a lot of gradients going on. Like they probably sculpted this stuff and baked down the AO and then painted on top of it. So there's a lot of gradients, things are a bit more muted, and then our eyes are immediately drawn to these characters where their colors are solid, which is helping a lot. But the outline is really making them pop from the background. And since we're only doing it on a very small amount of things on the screen, and those things are honestly relatively cheap to begin with, we can totally get away with this method. It's not the biggest deal. The other cool thing other than cost is that this is really helping to emulate the look of traditional animation, right? Because like normally you'd have the moving cells or the moving frames have a nice outline around them because we're swapping them out so quickly and they can't afford to be as detailed as the background. And so we're really getting sort of 2 birds with 1 stone with this method. It's going to be pretty optimal, honestly, as long as the background isn't using it a ton, and it's going to help draw our eyes to it. And then on top of that, it's emulating exactly the kind of look that we're going for here. So that's why I think this method works pretty good. You could totally use a post-processing volume as well if that's your cup of tea, but for me, this is going to give us like very tight control, specific to every single asset, and we can change things very quickly and on the fly. Alright, so let's move on to talk about the texture maps and how the UVs are laid out on this model. So if I go ahead and open up the content drawer here, there's actually only 3 main textures that sort of drive this entire look. That's going to be the underscore base, the underscore SSS, and the underscore ILM. So let's just quickly go over what each of these are doing. The underscore base texture is exactly what you'd guess it to be. It's just a normal base color pretty much. And it's laid out in more of an atlas style. So it's interesting. It kind of looks like with this, it wasn't sort of laid out and then textured on top of it. It really sort of gives the vibe that this was laid out and the texture was made with the model at the same time. But it's pretty cool. Lots of reuse on this. And yeah, just a sort of traditional atlas style texture. Next up, we have the underscore SSS texture. And this is a little bit weird because traditionally you'd think SSS is subsurface scattering, and for those of you who don't know, subsurface scattering is something used in a lot more photorealistic renders. Traditionally what it's used for is something like thin parts of skin or a plant, and it shows how much light can penetrate the surface of that material. In this case, what it stands for is sub-shadow surface, and what it's doing is just saying, hey, once the model is in shadow, we're going to swap things out into this material, or this texture on the material rather, and this sort of gives us full control over when something is in shadow. We can have it be the exact colors we want, rather than just sort of tinting it or lowering the value of the brightness or something like that. We have full control over exactly what the colors look like when it's in shadow. And then our final map is the ILM map, and this is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. So I couldn't really find what ILM stands for. I think it might be illumination possibly, but that might be a bit of a stretch, as you'll see in a second. And this is a texture map that's packed in housing 4 different masks actually into its RGBA values. So let's take a look at what each of those are doing. The R value, from what I understand, is controlling the shadow intensity, so how quickly something wants to be turned into shadow. I came to this conclusion based on a talk at GDC that some of the Guilty Gear developers had. That's a really good talk, by the way. I highly recommend watching it if you have any interest in this topic whatsoever. That's where I got a lot of this information from, so I'll have that linked in the description below. But they did say that they did have a map packed in their material somewhere that dictated how quickly or easily something will be sort of put into shadow, and I came to this conclusion because the one part of this model that is supposed to stay emissive even in the dark is blacked out in this channel. So I figure, hey, that's probably what this map is doing, and slotted it into my material, and it seemed to be working pretty good in that regard. Then there's the G value. So G seems to be a mask that's just showing where the baked in AO is. I know this because it's just kind of in all the crevices of the model, and you can also see parts where it's just logical that this is shadow information. The B is kind of the most visually appealing one. So B is being used to show where the shine overlay is. So pretty much when I tilt the model into sunlight, where we're getting sort of sheens going across the model. And then when we have the A value, or what's packed into the A value rather, is the inlines that are baked onto the texture sheet. So what I mean by this is we sort of have this nice outline that we're getting from the inverse hull, but we can't really dictate where lines on the model will be anywhere other than the perimeter. So we sort of have to have a map that shows exactly where we want these sort of anime style or animation style drawn lines on the actual texture itself, and that's what the alpha channel is doing in this case. So now that we have an understanding of all of this, let's go ahead and actually dive into Maya and see how all of this stuff is laid out in a way, and why they've just sort of decided to pack everything in such a weird, unique to Guilty Gear style texture sheet. Alright, so here we are inside of Maya. We're just popping in here to quickly take a look at how the UVs are laid out on this model. So you can sort of follow along with this in any modeling package. It's really not too specific, but I just have the base color applied here for now. And we're going to be looking at two different textures. We're going to be looking at the base color applied to this model, and then we're also going to be looking at the alpha channel of the ILM, which is the inlines. And between how those two maps are laid out, there should be a pretty good understanding of how they've sort of approached all of their textures for Guilty Gear Strive. So as I mentioned before, this main one is just very much like an Atlas style. So what I mean by that is there's like a brown square here, a gray square here, dark gray, a red area, and then if we want that color, we're just laying our UV shells into that area. Which is pretty cool. It's very, very simple, very, very streamlined. I would imagine that all this stuff would be sort of sketched out and figured out ahead of time, and then, like I said, as they're modeling it, they're sort of making room on the UV sheet and texturing as they go. This works really great as well because we don't really need a ton of texture space for a lot of these things. Like if I grab this UV shell, it's really irrelevant if something is this size or this size because it's going to look the exact same either way. Texel density is king with this method. They talked about this in their GDC talk, but since everything is based on a solid color for the most part, we're not going to get any fuzzy textures anywhere. Everything is super crisp, and we're only transitioning from different values when we're going from polygon to polygon. And because of so, everything has a nice, super sharp transition in color value. Now we do have a couple areas like where it says rattle here that are more of a pattern, and there is room to lose texel density, but since they're more rare, like we can scale these things way up. So this is a gigantic section of the texture sheet, and that's also really great because as you can see, we've scaled this way up in a way that this area has way less texel density than this area, but that's totally fine because they both have the same background color and they blend into each other perfectly anyways. So even though there are a few areas that sort of need specific details like this tag as well, we can put like a ton of texture room here because everything else just needs a smaller area because blending doesn't really matter. Everything's just on a solid color, and that's all we really need in our texture sheet. So really cool stuff, really, really smart, and a great way to have consistent texel density across everything because, well, everything is just a solid color and texel density doesn't matter all that much. So yeah, very cool, basic Atlas kind of style. Now moving on, there's another thing that we have going on here, and that's going to be the inlines, and this is going to show how some of the weirder stuff that we saw earlier is working. So I'm going to go ahead and apply, the alpha lines here. And yeah, let's turn off that grid. So as you can see, we have all of these weird outlines on everything. So everything is using the exact same UV shells from before, but now everything has sort of like a sort of black outline drawn around it. And what could this be used for? So if we look at our model again, this is the map that has these cool sort of hand-drawn anime cartoon lines here, manga style. And if we go ahead and maybe focus in on an area, let's maybe focus in on here. And let's find where that is. You can see that we just have this mapped out just to sort of fit wherever the color was on the base color. But then there's this black outline around everything. And that black outline is transitioning into this black outline here. And how this is working is if we grab these UVs and we pull it in and pull it out, we're changing the thickness. So how much this these UVs are sort of dipping into the blackness, the thicker or thinner the line is getting, which is really smart. So they obviously just laid things out in their Atlas style base color, and then in this map just sort of traced lines around everything, and then they went in by hand and just sort of said, hey, let's push and pull things a little bit and get these hand-drawn lines. So we could sort of make this a little bit more interesting if we maybe deselect the top areas here and thin it out a little bit. So we'll push this into the white a bit more, take these and push them in a little bit more. And you can see how quickly, using this method, just by making sure we have these black lines around everything, we can now get a sort of hand-drawn, sketched, tapered line in this area. And you see this used in a little bit of a better way across the model. Like there's a really interesting example. And here, like if we wanted this to be a little bit thicker, I could find this area and be like, hey, okay, we have this area here that's probably, what was this, like a gray color or a white color. They drew some black outlines around everything, and then they just sort of dipped it in there to get this transitional, thin, sort of hand-drawn sketch line. Like if we want that to be thicker, all we have to do is grab this area and pull it into the darkness a little bit more, maybe taper that in a bit of a smoother way, and now it's much thicker. And just the way that this is being used and how subtle it is, like this once again isn't going to affect our texel density whatsoever. Like yes, if you get in there pretty closely, it's kind of soft, but that doesn't really look bad. Like even though it might be stretching quite a bit, this still looks great, especially because we're just using this to overlay some lines information. Like these are just lines, right? So it doesn't have to be super crispy. As long as it's not pixelated, it's gonna look good. And I think it's kind of weird because a lot of the times you would think like, why don't you just sort of do this in the base color? Obviously this is some like crazy optimization way of working on things, but it's also done in a way where it's really quick to iterate on things. Like these lines here, like if I want all of these lines to be a little bit thicker, like I can just sort of find where this is, grab all of these UVs, and then just be like, I want this all to be a little bit bolder. So it's partly a very optimized way of working, but also a very quick way to iterate on things. And it's pretty fun. I kind of want to go back and dive into some of the other characters. Like there's a character named Potemkin, and he's very bold and menacing, and all of his lines are very thick. I'd love to see sort of how much of these UVs are bleeding into the darker outline areas. So pretty cool. The bulk of all the textures are done using these two methods. It really seems like they start with the base color like this, lay everything out in this way, and then they would just sort of like add an outline to all of these and make the background white, and then just sort of play with how they want things to get those cool inlines as well. So that's the bulk of it. If you are curious and maybe seeing how you can approach this yourself, I found this cool YouTube series by user Hero Archus. He's sort of going through Blender and making his own character, and he's sort of using the exact same style of workflow, and his stuff's looking pretty good. So I'll have a link to this in the description if you're curious. But yeah, that's kind of my takeaway from looking at the textures and how the UVs are laid out. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. I would love to know if they really need to optimize things this far. This seems a little overkill. For me, I think it's mostly just because it's like really quick to iterate on things, and it is like a very great way to have a consistent texel density across the model. But anyways, with that understood and that under our belt, let's go ahead and take a look at the next part of the pipeline, which would be the decals on the model. Alright, so next up in the pipeline is the decals, and this part is actually pretty simple, and it goes hand in hand with the texture map that we just looked at. For those of you who don't know, I'll quickly summarize exactly what decals are. Decals are pretty much parts of a texture or a material that we can bake down and lay on top of pre-existing geometry or models to add a bit more detail. So a good example of that would be like if we had a piece of broken concrete, we could bake that down to a decal and use it with something like a pre-existing sidewalk in our game environment, and then the sidewalk could have its own material and its own texel density and be working great, and then the decal could have its own material and texel density, and we can mix and match and swap around where we're placing this crack decal decal or damaged decal, and have a lot of room for customization, but both of these things could exist on their own with really no dependence on each other whatsoever. So they're really good. It's great for a flexible workflow, and it's great for adding a bit more extra detail to our models and environments. And we can also use them on an asset-to-asset level. So let's take a look at where they're being used here. Just to quickly kind of bring this back here. So we have our blueprint, and as you can see, we have the main material applied to pretty much everything, but there's a slot here for another material, and this is our decal setup. So if I go ahead and click over a tab, this is the material instance I made for the decals, and it's very, very simple. The only thing here to change that I've set up at least is the tint. So let's go ahead and see if we can change the color, and we'll take a look at where the decals are placed on this model. So I can bring this up a little bit. Maybe we'll make it red, or just sort of bring the colors around. And you can see they're kind of scattered throughout the model, doing a bunch of different stuff. And they're really nice. So they're working, if I just sort of put that back to black, they're working in tandem with those inner lines that we were looking at before to add a bit more of a hand-drawn look. Something that's sort of sketched out in the outline section here, as if we're mimicking hand-drawn animation, like the whole workflow is built around. And let's go ahead and take a look at the material. Very, very simple. So we have where we plug in our decal texture, and then I'm just multiplying it for an emissive color. And then we have the alpha going into the opacity mask. Very, very simple. And let's go ahead and take a look at the actual texture itself to see what's going on here. So why are we using these at all? Why aren't we just sort of looking at those lines that we had before and having that be our main driving factor for these details? So what I'm going to do is, let's make this a bit bigger. I'm going to turn off all these channels so we get a better look at things. What these decals are doing is pretty much mimicking the look of those inlines that we were just looking at, but for more complex things. Like, we wouldn't be able to get a shape like this or anything round like a circle or any of these details here, none of this text or anything like that. We wouldn't really be able to get that just with polygons and cutting things out. We definitely could, but it would be really messy geometry, and it would just be easier to have a separate texture sheet. Like, this is only 1K, and it's literally just like black and white information, so it's super cheap, and it's going to make things really easy on us to sort of place these details down. So by making a texture sheet like this, not only can we blow up these details to be really big and have a lot of texture texel density, so things are going to stay very round, and we don't need to worry about pixelation or lower res or anything like that, but it's just going to be way easier to work with. So let's go ahead and go over here and go to Show, Advanced, and Mesh Edges. And now we can see the wireframe of our model in game. And we can actually see where these decals are being placed. So we have just sort of like a single square here, or two triangles, and you can see that this just has the decal material applied to it, and then the UV map was placed over this like little rectangle here. This one was placed on this circle here, and then we have, like, I don't know, the text over here and stuff like that. So as you can see, once we have the decal sheet laid out, it's really easy to add these details. Like, the inlines are a little bit more tricky, but this stuff is super quick. Like, once you have it set up, you're pretty much good to go. And anytime you see sort of like a floating plane, it's going to be, yeah, chances are it's from the decal sheet. Yeah, they're pretty much all over the model. So really cool stuff, really simple setup. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. Advanced and Mesh Edges. The only thing you might be thinking after seeing that is, like, why do we have, you know, these triangles or this text or something like that built into our main texture sheet? And I think that's just a matter of color. Like, this whole decal sheet is for black specifically, and then they sort of built in anything with a color value into the main texture sheet. I think they can get away with it. They have the room for the texel density. I think you could probably make it more simple if you wanted to put all of the decals on this sheet. I'm sure that's fine. I think for areas like this where there's text and it's like blending from one value to another, I think it really is just easier to have this all in base color. But for little details like this, like, these are the final finishing touches, so I would imagine they'd make this decal sheet at the very end and then start placing like a lot of these little details. Yeah, that's pretty much, like, once again, just a guess. I don't know this stuff 100%. You could also argue that, like, a lot of these decal-specific details seem to be kind of like holes, like these circles here. And maybe they have it set up in a way where, I don't know, I haven't really paid too much attention to this, but if they have, like, a special effect going off, they could probably have a parameter that says like, oh, a special move is happening, we can make it glowing now, and these specific details only are glowing while the rest stays the same. So you have that freedom with decals if you want to make it a separate material. But yeah, really simple, an extra little layer of detail on top of everything. And yeah, we're not going to be getting details like these complex shapes or text or anything like that using the inline method from before. So yeah, that's pretty much how the decals are working on this model. And now that we have all the sort of groundwork knowledge under our belt, let's go ahead and take a look at the actual shader that's putting everything together. Okay, so now we can finally take a look at the shader that's kind of putting everything that we've looked at so far together and giving us this cool look inside of Unreal Engine. Let's start off with looking at the material instance for this guy. So I have exposed a bunch of parameters so we can change a bunch of things on the fly. Just in case you're not, totally happy with the default look, we can swap things out really easily. So let's sort of go through this from top to bottom. Starting off, AO intensity, use AO map. So this is referring to the green channel that we were looking at before. So we can turn that off if we don't want to use it at all, but we can also affect the intensity. So if we just have it on 1, it's going to be a lot darker. 2, 3. The ILM map here, the AO that was baked into it, kind of had a gray value as the default. I think it was a little on the darker end, so when I bump this up to 2, it's looking more like how it was in game. So depending on what you're working with, you might want to keep it on 1, but I found that this was a little bit too dark. This just seemed a little bit more accurate, and we can just turn that off entirely if we don't want to use it. The baked in inlines as well, so these lines that we went over here, we can turn those on and off if we want to. So if you don't want to use this map at all, we can just sort of completely bypass that. That's totally fine. By default, I just sort of have these maps in here, but we can, turn these on and swap in different maps. If we want a different base color, different shadow look, and a different ILM, we can really quickly swap those out. That's totally fine. So I would imagine, if we have a whole scene or a whole cast of characters or something that rely on this type of shader, this kind of setup would be ideal for just sort of swapping things out in and out pretty quickly. Some fine tuning here at the end if we want to bump up the contrast or lower it. We can do that quickly. Same with saturation. We can make things very saturated, non-saturated. Once again, you can tie these to maybe like an effect that's happening in game, so that's always a cool option. We have a bunch of control over the shadow as well, so we can turn off the shadow intensity map if we don't want it on. Or sorry, we can invert it in case we want to see how that's looking. Shadow depth, we can change how quickly things are turning into shadow. So I think by default that's on 0.5, which is just going to be in the middle. This is pretty cool. We have the option to change just how the shadow is being tinted. So maybe if there's like a specific look you want to unify all of your models, have everything sort of have a warmer shadow to them, you can go ahead and do that. We also can use red channel shadow intensity, so we can just turn this on and off completely. Like if we don't want to use that map at all, once again, we can completely bypass this whole ILM. And what that's going to do is just sort of revert back to the default look. So without that map, this is how things are going to look like in shadow. So having that on is going to help a lot with helping us choose specifically what we do and don't want to show. And then use shadow base color texture map, which is this thing here. We can just turn that off completely, right? We don't really need it. And what that's going to allow us to do then is, instead of relying on this, we can just sort of, say, hey, we want our shadows to be darker. And yeah, we can do it this way. And you can see, with this setup, why exactly we would probably want something like this here. It's doing a couple things. One is keeping this strip illuminated even in shadow, which is really nice, but it's also just giving us more control over the colors. So I'm going to opt to keep that turned on. It's just looking more proper in the way things are supposed to be set up. And the final thing that we have set up here is the shine. So this whole section related to when we tilt this into the sunlight and we get these shine effects on everything. The first thing is activation angle. So as you can see, it's like in sun here, but it's not shining yet. It's not until we tilt it more into sun. So we can change this number and say like, hey, if we turn it lower, it's going to get into shine quicker, or we can turn it way up and it's not going to go into shine until it's like really facing the sun there. So you have control over that. I'm going to just put that back to what it was. We also have control over the color of the shine. So if we have like a blue light, we can maybe make this blue, a little bit of a blue subtle tint there, and then shine opacity, we can make that a bit brighter, and then we can just turn off the shine altogether if we don't want to use that. So yeah, it's set up in a way where we have a lot of control over everything, and we can quickly swap in new maps and apply it to a model on the fly. So let's go ahead and take a look at exactly how all of this is tying together by actually looking at the master material. Now, I'm going to quickly go over this. I don't think it's the easiest thing to just kind of break this down. There's a lot of spaghetti stuff going on here, but just to kind of go over the essentials here pretty much. Like, this is just a default lit shading model. Everything is being plugged into emissive, and then, like I showed at the start with the other material, we're just killing the specular and making things very rough to make sure we're only relying on emissive color information. But we can still quickly go through all of this and quickly explain how things are working. It looks a lot more complicated than it is, just because I have a bunch of switches and stuff. Like, do we want to use this shadow mask? So if we hit yes, we're going to have one string. If we hit no, we're going to have another string of options. So basically what's going on, just to really quickly run through all of this, is we start with our base color, then we start layering things onto it. So base color, now we're layering on our baked inlines that we have here, and then we have a switch saying, do we want them on and off? Then we sort of have our shadows. Do we want shadows to be reliant on a tint, or do we want them to be reliant on a input map? And then once again, we have a switch for that. Same with shadow intensity. Do we want to use this red channel map? Yes or no? And then we have, like, if we choose yes, we're multiplying it by a certain value, and this is going to let us control how far up the shadow is. So we're kind of going through everything and blending everything through that way. Same with the AO, and once again, we just have a lot of exposed parameters. The more complex area is going to be the shine, where it's similar to how we're blending between the normal color and the shadow, but we have some levels here, and this is what's kind of giving us the activation angle. We can clamp to say, hey, only when we have a certain input and a certain angle from the sunlight, we want to get that shine, and we can make that a bit more harsh than when we're going from shadow to normally a illuminated value, and then we can tint things a little bit here after that's figured out, and choose to turn it on or off. And then of course the final adjustments here, just to quickly get some control over saturation and contrast. Now, that was a pretty quick run through. I guess I'll zoom in and slowly pan through everything in case you want to copy how things are looking. Use the AO, use shine, and final adjustments. But you might be thinking, okay, so what exactly is then determining when something is in light and when something is in shadow? How are we sort of blending between all this stuff? And that is going to be driven by this here, which is going to be finding our light source. Now, I saved this for the end because, as I mentioned earlier in the video, there's a few different ways we can find our light source, a few different ways that we can sort of blend everything together in our model through finding the light source, and this is just one version of that. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the video here for the material part, and then we can sort of take a deeper dive into the lighting setup for the shader and how exactly that's all working. Alright, so picking up where we left off there, what we're going to be doing now is taking a look at the lighting information that sort of drives the masks within this shader. So firstly, this is important because, as you can see here, and we just talked about, everything is being driven by emissive, and that means we're not going to be getting any natural shadows on this model from things such as the skylight or any other lights in the scene or anything like that. So we're going to have to find a way to figure out that information through masks and things that we can do in the material setup and some blueprints. So there's going to be three main ways that we're going to be exploring to do this. They're going to start with really simple techniques, something really simple and multi-purpose, which is going to be what we're going to start off with here, and that's going to be the thing that's applied to this version of the sword that we've been looking at throughout the entire video, so really easy stuff to follow along with. And then we're going to move into some more asset-specific, more tricky, blueprinty stuff along the way, but that gives us a lot more control and adds some additional things that we can't do with this model. So it's going to be a wide range of stuff, and none of these are really better than the other. It just all depends on what you're trying to use them for. So this first method that we're going to be going over here, I came across from this YouTuber on this specific video. Their name is or ES, I'm not exactly sure, but they have a really good tutorial on setting up stylized characters and whatnot inside of UE4. They're using Genshin as an example, but it's pretty universal. And this is also the channel I came across to learn more about making these outlines. So I'll have this person linked in the description. Definitely worth checking out their stuff. But the long short of it is, if we go ahead and I kind of want to keep this in view, but I guess we can just sort of go back and forth. The long short of it is what's driving all of this lighting information is literally just 3 nodes here. We are using a dot to kind of blend together the atmospheric light vector and the vertex normal world space. So let's go ahead and preview this node and see exactly what's going on here. So start preview, and if we go ahead and look at our little preview window, we have white at the top and black at the bottom. And essentially what this is just doing is it's saying when the light is angled in a certain way, we're going to make that white, and when the light is not angled in that direction, we're going to make it black. So just depending on where the light is pointing from the sky, we're getting a mask, and that's great. So let's actually see what that looks like when we plug that directly into our emissive, so we have a better idea as to how that's working in game. So I'm going to just plug that in there. Let's go ahead and hit save. So this is just exactly what we were previewing. Super simple. It's going to get rid of all of our colors and stuff, but you can see how useful this is. So yeah, essentially we're getting a nice mask of where things are in shadow, they're shaded out, and when light is hitting them, it's white. And of course this is going to update in real time as well, and it's going to be synced with our skylight here. One thing to note though that I had a bit of difficulty with when I first set this up was this atmospheric light vector that's sort of driving all of it. You want to make sure for the skylight that is working with this as well, you want to, or directional light rather, you want to find that and then type in atmosphere and just make sure that this is checked on. I believe it's off by default, but this is going to need to be on for this to be working in tandem with the material. So that's kind of the mask that's driving everything. I'm going to go back and plug this back in before I forget and save that. But as you can see with that mask that's sort of figuring out where the skylight is pointing in real time, we can really use that to drive all that information we discussed before in the shader, things such as when things are in shadow, when they're not in shadow. And as soon as this is done saving, we're going to go back and investigate that a little bit. So there we go. Let's go ahead and bring this up a little bit. So it's all being blended together through this if statement. So just to quickly go over what's going on, A is going to be that mask, B being shadow, and then AB is going to be the main color information, A equals B is going to be the shadow, and then A less than B is also going to be the shadow. And then we can start using this information to blend into the AO and the shine and all of that kind of stuff. And just kind of have that being used as our main driver to say, hey, when things are in sunlight, it's going to look like this. And when it's not, this is how our shadowed look is going to be with this map that we have plugged in. So pretty cool. I think this is the most universal technique for all of this stuff. For those of you who saw recently, in Fortnite, they actually recently added some Naruto characters, and that's kind of crazy because Fortnite has its own sort of stylized look to it, but these characters are all cell shaded, and they have like a much more distinct pop look that sort of matches this here. And I wanted to see what they were doing because the biggest issue with this technique, and I guess I'll spill the beans on it right now, is yes, we can update things based on the angle of the directional light, but that's it. There's no way for this to detect when it's in shadow, right? So if I put it under here where it should go into shade, it's not going to be able to figure that out. So I was looking at these models from Fortnite that were adding in all these Naruto characters, and I noticed that when these characters went into buildings, when they went under trees and stuff like that where they should be in shade, they also weren't switching to their shaded counterpart. So I would imagine that this method is kind of the universal method that most people use. It's really quick, really easy. As long as you're outside, it's going to look accurate most of the time. And honestly, like even in shaded areas, it's pretty fine. but I just want to make that clear that we don't really get that information from that. But yeah, I just thought it was funny that in Epic Games, you know, one of the biggest games in the world, Fortnite, they're not really going to incorporate that shadow information. So this is probably just straight up the most popular method for this kind of stuff. Now, if we move forward and we're like, hey, what if we do want to get around that problem? That brings us to our second example here, and let's go ahead and look at this sword. If I move it into shade, now we're getting some shadow information on here. So let's bring that back out, and let's start discussing exactly what is going on with this second lighting model. Alright, so moving on to method 2 here, we got some cool stuff going on, right? We have shadows, we're solving some problems with the previous model. Another cool thing is that we now have an independent directional light that's only affecting this model. So it's working in tandem in a way where it's like we can have the background be lit in a certain way. We can, I don't know, let's maybe just straight up delete this light so there's no light in the scene. But then we can still use this and light our models in a way that is independent from everything else. So everything is being independently lit. That gives us a lot of freedom and a lot of control over our models, which is really cool. But there are some limitations with this. So to begin with, this is a lot more complicated of a setup. And secondly, you'll notice in just a second, I move this into shadow, and yes, every instance of this model will also be moved into shadow because the material is just detecting when a ray is being cast off and hitting something and changing the properties of the material. So it doesn't matter if, it doesn't really matter how many of these there are in the scene. As long as one of them is hitting something, then it is going to swap that material out, and the material is applied to multiple things at the same time. So let's go through exactly what's going on here, starting with just the material view. Now this is more or less exactly what we just went over. The only difference is how we're finding our light source, and then now we're checking if it's in shade. We have this like additional follow-up here, but we're gonna have all the exact same parameters. Everything is going to be the same setup, but there's a lot more going on under the hood. Now I'm gonna be straight up honest and blunt at the start here. All the systems that are making this work are a little out of my comfort zone as an environment artist. We're going to be going into more blueprint stuff, more like directional light blueprints, mixing with asset blueprints, mixing with materials. So what I want to do is shout out to the tutorial that sort of caught me up to speed with all of this stuff. Channel strangely named. I'll have them linked in the description. This tutorial is going to go over pretty much everything that this lighting method has to offer. Mine though, I guess I had to Frankenstein a couple things together with the previous video we watched. So if you want the general idea as to what's going on, this is going to be a much more clear explanation. This person clearly understands it a lot more, but I'll do a basic rundown just to catch everyone up to speed a little bit. So we're starting off by making a material parameter collection. If we go ahead and take a look at that, very simple default value blue. I believe this is to indicate pointing up in a normal map, and then we're giving that a parameter name. Moving forward, we're taking this and we then have a blueprint for that directional light, and this is the directional light that is specifically affecting the mesh that we were just looking at to make sure that it's independently lit. And for assets that are looking for more of a Guilty Gear specific style, they actually mentioned in their GDC talk that every asset is independently lit. So this probably is the method or something similar to this that they went with. So anyways, we have this, it's just a directional light with an arrow so we know where it's pointing. And if we go to the construction script, we are casting forward ray upwards to detect shadow casting objects. So this, well, like I said, it's a little outside of my comfort zone, but what we're doing is we are getting a forward vector, which is essentially casting a ray out of our model, and it's going to see if it is hitting anything. The event graph is making sure that's happening when we play the game. So what we can do there is if we go to our viewport, this is a different blueprint for our sword. So for those of you who were paying attention a little bit earlier to a lot of the specific details here, we have different assets for different shader setups. So this is going to be, like this was the original one we were looking at, which is just a sword with the outline material applied to it and nothing else. Then we have this, which is the sword outlined with a unique light, which is going to be this second method. So let's take a look at what's going on there. In the viewport, it's the same thing. We just have the normal sword. We have our outline sword version, but then we have a lot of stuff going on in the event graph in the construction script. So long story short, what is going on here? We are getting that information from before to see where the sun is pointing. We're now casting a ray out of our model. We are then sort of delaying the time between when that ray is hitting something and when we're sort of getting that information and changing anything. And then we're plugging that back into our directional light parameter so we can get it into our material. From there, we just have this simple setup where we're getting that parameter and we're extracting the mask information out of it, and we're using this to find our light source and plugging it into where we had things set up in the previous material. And then once again, we're checking if things are in shade at the very end to completely swap things out to be only in shadow. So if things are in shade, if we are hitting a ray against an asset, we're swapping everything out to be in shade, while this is just seeing where the sunlight is being pointed at. So a little bit more complicated, as you can see, but it's giving us way more flexibility. So this method, it's harder to set up for sure. The downsides are that you are going to have to do this setup for everything you want to have an independently lit surface for. So if I wanted two swords like this and I wanted this one to stay out of shadow when this is going into shadow, I'm going to have to make a whole system for this and give it its own material. So that's a little bit tedious. I'm sure there's ways that you can set up the material to have parameter values to swap things in and out and make it a little bit more easy. That said, it's always going to be way more complicated than this first method, so just be aware of that. But this is cool because if you do want to dynamically move things in between shadows, you can set things up to sort of aid with that quite a bit. Let's go ahead and actually see these rays. So if I go to, I'm a little bit rusty on this, construction script I believe is in the viewport, correct? Let's go ahead and see. Okay, right, so construction script is going to be the viewport, event graph is going to be in game. What I was trying to do for a second, I was just fumbling around there for a bit. Draw debug type, let's change this to persistent and hit compile. Okay, so here we go. As you can see, we're getting a ray cast out from our objects, so we're getting essentially the direction of the skylight. As you can see, this arrow and this light is going to be one and the same. We can then use that information to cast it off of our assets, and it's great because we can once again get the information of the angle of the sunlight and use that as our mask to emulate what we were doing before. But we can also use this ray to say if we hit something, we're going to be getting a different type of information. So we're going to move this, and as you can see, once we hit this roof, it's going to simulate like, hey, there's something above this. We're getting this ray being turned to green, and if we know something's above it, we have set our material to say, hey, we're going to push this into shadow, and we're swapping in that SSS map. So a lot more complicated than our previous system, but we're getting some cool effects and control over it. A lot harder to set up, but if you're just doing it for like one asset at a time, or if you modify things a little bit to be able to quickly swap out parameters and sub things out for an asset to asset level, this might be a useful technique. The reason I think that this might be something that you could do for a fighting game like Guilty Gear is if you have everything angled to a asset off screen, you could probably set it up so that this is hitting a volume where something might be putting it into shade, and if this collides with that volume, then you can swap this material to be a little bit darker, or just tweak it to be a little bit more in shadow than it would be otherwise. So this is one probable method, but even though it's a good way to swap things in and out of shadow, I think the setup for it is pretty complicated. I don't know if I'd want to be doing this for dozens and dozens of assets. But anyways, like I said, that was kind of like the TLDR of it, a pretty quick recap. If you are more curious in this setup, highly recommend this video. This user also explains how to get normal maps working in this system and a bunch of other cool stuff. So once again, I'll leave this in the description below. But yeah, that'll do it for our second method for lighting this kind of shader. Alright, so we looked at a quick and easy way to get a pretty efficient look, and we looked at a much more complex way to get a more precise look. So where does that leave us? That is going to take us to our third and final lighting method, and this one is quite a bit different. As you can already see, this is an entirely different scene, and that's because this is going to be borrowing from a setup made by a Tumblr user who goes by the name of Christian Sparks. This is a really, really cool setup that they have going on here. So let's quickly look at one of their videos. What they have done is they've made a way to hook up a blueprint to any of the lights in your scene that is going to detect whether you're in lighting or whether you're not in lighting. And that's what we're seeing in this video here. The sort of arrow is illuminating depending on if the character is in light. But even since this video, it's been developed on even further to extract color information from when you are being lit. So let's quickly go ahead and take a look at what's going on here. We're going to be seeing all the guts and all the behind the scenes of what's happening when I hit play. But if we're walking, we can see a little square above our character, and our character is illuminating. So we are in yellow light, and our character is turning yellow. Blue light, and our character is turning blue. We're getting purple, we're getting green information. And this is really, really valuable stuff for what we're trying to accomplish here. So I think this is going to be the best method for figuring things out, and I'll explain exactly why in a second. But if I bring up some more gameplay, I kind of thought this method would be very appropriate and work very well, because I don't think in this game it is simply characters having a material that is completely independent from everything else, and that's being driven to lit everything. In the GDC talk where they discussed how the shaders were done in the previous game, they did say that everything was independently lit, and I think that's changed from Guilty Gear Xrd to Strive. If we look at this sort of frame from this gameplay right here, we can see everything is pretty cool, a lot more gray in tone than other gameplay we've looked at, and you could say that might just be a post-processing volume or something. But in this same match, if we scrub forward a little bit and move on to one of the other spawn locations, this is the same map, and you can clearly see that there is a light coming in and things are a lot more warm, and this is kind of affecting the overall look. So this got me thinking as to other ways that we can approach things, and if there would be a way to get lighting information into our materials. And through this method here, we're essentially able to take a light, give it a color. All we then have to do is put this volume around it and attach it to it, and we can extract the lighting information and move that into our material. So let's quickly go over how exactly I've gone and done that. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the background with these blueprints, and this is all free stuff to download, by the way. I'll have this all linked in the description, and once again, huge shout out to Christian Sparks on this. Really cool stuff. So all I've really done is I've gone and similar to the last one, I've made a parameter collection, and I've just called this test value. All I'm doing is getting a default value, which is black to begin with. So just a straight up black color, no information. I'm then finding in the blueprint where we're getting our color information from, and I'm saying, hey, let's change that parameter to be whatever color that is. And now that we have this set up, we can make a material and extract that test value from it. So we're changing things based on the blueprint and what it's picking up from the lights in our scene. We can take that, and all I'm doing is multiplying that by like 10 to get a much more intense emissive and plugging that in. And as we saw before, when I run around, we're getting that lighting information based on the volumes, and I just applied the material to the character. So he's going to be glowing yellow when he's near yellow, and green when he's near green, etc. So I think this is the method that I would opt for. All we need to do is whenever there's a light that we want to affect our shader, we just have to put this blueprint around it, and we get all the color information. And what we can do is combine that with the previous stuff we did. So we could have the previous style of shader, but we could sort of have this set up where if this parameter is black, we can sub that in to say, hey, we're in shade, and let's use the SSS map, which is going to make things way more simple, way more easy. And then when we are in color, we could maybe branch that off somewhere and multiply that color in slightly with our normal base color and have a bit of a tint dependent on the lighting, similar to this scene here. So if I was doing everything from scratch, I had to remake this game, remake the shaders and lighting setups, this is what I would go for. I didn't actually go through and do all of that because, like I said, like this is someone else's work. I'll have it linked into the description, but if you want to recreate an entire scene or an entire game with this method, I'd look into this kind of stuff. Give this person some love. I don't know if they have a Patreon or anything like that, but give them a follow, give them a like. This is totally what I would do. Frankenstein together the first material with this stuff, and I think you'd be golden with a really accurate to Guilty Gear Strive material. So I think that'll do it for this tutorial. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for taking the time to come and watch this and check it out. It's a little bit different than what I normally post on this channel and the tutorials that I normally make. So yeah, I appreciate that. For those of you who have been following me for a while, you'd probably know that I've been posting a lot of tutorials this week, some a little bit smaller, some bigger, some with partnering with other companies such as ArtStation. All of those have been very fun, but the thing about making tutorials is they're a very long process, and for me personally, my favorite part about doing them is actually releasing them and seeing the community feedback and people saying that they found it useful, or maybe more advice I could have, or tips that I can be getting in feedback sections to explain how I could do something a little bit better. So the actual process of making these things is time consuming, and as much as there are enjoyable parts in there, they definitely are quite a handful to make from time to time. Because of so, what I wanted to do with this tutorial is just something that's a lot more fun as I'm going along. So obviously I really enjoy Guilty Gear, so staying in that kind of zeitgeist has been a lot more enjoyable than the average tutorial, but also just the sheer amount of learning I had to do for this was very refreshing. It was something totally different. I don't normally do stylized art. That's pretty outside of my comfort zone, but I love the art style, and this gave me an opportunity and an excuse kind of to go ahead and learn it and figure all that stuff out, and then sort of rehash it into a video for all of you. And it gave me an opportunity to edit some videos and do a bit more work with that, which I haven't done in a while, and learn something totally new along the way. So I had a lot of fun with this. If you are all enjoying kind of this, like, taking a game I am fond of at the time and reverse engineering it into a video, I'd be really happy to do more of these in the future. So any feedback is super welcome in the comments as well. But as I mentioned before, like, this is something that's a little outside of my comfort zone, and I brought up a bunch of other tutorials and stuff that taught me along the way. So if you have any more questions about this stuff, I really encourage checking out the link in the description, because this probably isn't 100% accurate to how they're doing stuff in Guilty Gear. One of the main reasons I know that is because actually in the base color and the SSS map, there are two maps packed into the alpha channels of those that I just couldn't figure out what they're doing. Honestly, I'm just like, I'm plugging them into random places, thinking about what they could possibly be doing, and I couldn't figure it out. It could be like a cornerstone of the shader, or it could be something that's tied to effects. I honestly don't know. But the end results that we got, I think, are pretty good, and if I wanted to recreate an asset for that game, I would feel somewhat confident doing so now. I think I have a pretty good understanding of how they have stuff set up in that game. Honestly, after using Unreal Engine professionally for the past year or so, it's just been really refreshing to see something totally different on the spectrum of what you can do in that engine. And even though this stuff might not be super applicable to my day-to-day, it's just good to know that that stuff is in there, and if I want to try something totally new, I can go ahead and do that. So hopefully those of you who are watching can have a more practical application for this kind of stuff, or if you don't, just found it cool to sort of learn and see what you can do inside of Unreal Engine. But anyways, as I mentioned, all the resources from this video will be in the description below, along with the shader that I made for Unreal Engine 5. You can go ahead and pick that up off my Gumroad if you'd like to. But anyways, if you have any comments, anything you'd like me to do in the future, let me know in the comment section down below. But with that said, I think that'll wrap up this video. Thank you everyone once again for taking the time to watch this. Hopefully you all enjoyed, and I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.